This is a project I've been working on, as Kyle can attest to, for quite a few years, at least 7 or 8 years. And it's about the de Havilland 84 Dragon that flew in Canada. There are only a few Dragons flew in Canada, but it was all triggered by this initial picture, which I shared with Bob Bradford back in the 70s, and he put it in his collection somewhere. But it was an airplane. I'd never knew what it was. It was just a nice looking airplane. The lady in the front waving is my grandmother, and in front of her is my grandfather. And the fellow with the hat on, the trilby, I think they're called, he is my great grandfather. And my grandfather was working out of Liverpool, and he chartered several planes to go down to Bristol in 1935. So this picture was the resulting image. That's what got my interest, but I still didn't know what kind of airplane it was. So I got on the internet and I found the city of Cardiff with a registration at another angle. And Stuart Mackay, who's the head of the Moth Club in the UK, very helpful fellow, produces the Moth magazine, which is for all aircraft that were gypsy-powered aircraft. And they produce a quarterly journal, which is really very good. He put me on to the current owner of the same Dragon, DDI, which is now flying in Washington State. Mike Kimbrell's the owner, and he took my wife and I up for a flight in 2013. Basically, all he did was hand me a can of oil and say, put it in here, and then we started up the engines and away we went. And it raised the issue of, where did Dragons fly in Canada? Were there any? Well, we found out, of course, that in the beginning, de Havilland got set up in Canada in 1928 as a corporate entity. Their first airplane that they assembled was the Dragon, the DH.60 Moth, sorry. The one above is in the Alberta Aviation Museum. But more recently at Vintage Wings, if you've been over there, you'll see one that David Hadfield flew in just before Christmas in the fall. So that's a local interest there. There were 27 initially imported from the UK, and they were primarily used in the 1930s as trainers. And de Havilland was trying to sell into the States, but there were a lot of blockages to trade. And the Americans were resisting basically any aircraft that wasn't built in the States. So the next aircraft of note was the de Havilland Fox Moth, the 83C, which wasn't actually built in Canada before the war, but after the war it was, Second World War. The first one flew in 1932, and it was a useful aircraft when it was imported to Canada because it had relatively good lifting capacity. It was suitable on wheels, skis, and floats, which is obviously important in Canada in the backcountry, and had a relatively larger entry door. But if you've ever sat inside of one, it's pretty crowded for 2 or 3 people. Their knees are sort of into each other's groins, so it's a very tight fit. And this one that you see in the picture, of course, is flying out of Vintage Wings. And there were 53 in Canada. Now, the drawings show what was unique about the Dragon. This is a Dragon 1, which has square windows. They didn't have insulation on the inside for soundproofing. And it had retractable, swing wings, which were based on the original Fox Moth wing, which you saw on the previous page. But the rest of the aircraft was all new design. And they were designed because Hillman Airlines in England, and the north of England, wanted a plane that was a little more capacity, safer because of twin engine design. And that's what started the design work with de Havilland and Hillman. Eventually, Railway Air Services got into the game, which is the plane that my grandparents flew on. You can see here's a picture of the first Dragon to arrive in Canada. Is a Dragon 1 with the open framed windows, and first flew in 1932. Outer folding wing panels were used so they could fold back for storage. That was the way things were done in those days. Canadian assembly at de Havilland, Canada. And the Dragon 2 and 1 are slightly advanced. This is a picture taken at Charlottetown. You can imagine this poor fellow trying to start on skis. You swing the prop and then you have no brakes. So unless somebody's holding the tail back, or you've got some way of stopping the aircraft from sliding forward while you go to the other engine, it must have been quite a challenge. The lady was Mrs. Bentley at the time. I think I have friends in New Brunswick who are Bentleys, and I don't know if they're related, but that would be interesting to know. So for comparison purposes, between the 1 and the 2, you can see there's a slight improvement in range. The normal cruise speed is just slightly higher. Maximum speed, again, slightly higher. Maximum weight, 4,500 pounds, just 300-pound gain over the Dragon 1. Dimensions are the same and the engines were the same. So for people who like the statistics, the Dragon 2 had better performance. This picture is the inside of the cockpit of DDI in Washington State, and you can see it very basic. The instruments for RPMs and fuel are on the engine cowlings on both sides. So the pilot's not automatically looking at that, and that caused a few problems when planes ran out of fuel. They could take up to 6 passengers. And these are, you can see the seating here. This is in DDI, so it's in color. Windows are framed in the Dragon 2, same gypsy engines. Now in Canada, because a lot of them were operated on floats, they gave a sweeping tail, which is not common in the English versions of the aircraft, but they needed the sweeping tail to get the counteract the effect of floats. Let's see, here we go. Now, first Dragon 1 in Canada, they actually flew at Canadian Airways. Canadian Airways was flying in the Maritimes with them. This is Dragon 1. Notice they looked like an additional light put on the nose after the manufacturing. This is modern technology in the day. In 1933, an APJ was flying mail from Moncton and from Charlottetown over to the Magdalen Islands in the middle of winter. They were on skis, of course. And the names of the people in the picture are all listed there. But it was reduced to spares for CFAVD in October 1942. There was a lot of cannibalizing going on. Now, the Dragon, this is a G-ACJM or CFCJM, was originally intended to fly across the Atlantic from west to east. And Jim Mollison and Amy Johnson flew the Wayfarer 1 from England over to the States, and it crashed in a field at night, downwind, in near Boston. So they thought they'd try the opposite direction from Wasaga Beach for a trip across the Atlantic. You can see it here, CJM, in the Toronto hangars at de Havilland. And here's probably one of the other ones with Canadian Airways symbol on it. Probably the same one you saw in the earlier picture. Now, Leonard Reed and James Ailing bought Seafarer 2, as it was called, for the Wasaga Beach claim to try and get to Iran. And it was a distance record. Obviously, if you saw the ranges before, there's only about 500-mile range. So the aircraft was loaded with bladders, which weighed an awful lot. And when Mollison tried to take off from Wasaga Beach, the undercarriage was damaged. Also, they figured that they hadn't lifted the tail enough to get airborne. So they gave up on that effort, and Reed and Ailing bought the aircraft, modified it a little more, strengthened the undercarriage, and they attempted to cross the Atlantic the following year, which they succeeded in. And I have a video which I'll try and show you later of them talking after the flight. It was a Pathé video. But there's the two of them after the flight in the UK. Took 30 hours and 55 minutes. I don't think they were on board washrooms. And it was a long flight. They landed in England instead of continuing on to Iran because they had to use full power to keep the engine or keep the carburetors clear because they were flying at low altitude over the ocean. And they were worried that they'd run out of fuel. They had actually got enough fuel to make the trip, but for safety reasons, they'd put down just outside of London. And the next day, Reed took some people up for a joyride, and the plane crashed, and that was the end of her. There's a long story and lots of books written about this trip, but I'm just summarizing it briefly. AVD, and those are the serial numbers that you see at the top. She flew right across the country at different places. The upper picture's probably in the east, but she flew out in the west coast as well. And this is up near Haileybury, Ontario, on the dry, where she's on their floats getting serviced. They were initially fit with Fairchild floats out of Longhi, but later on, Edo floats were also applied, and they were flown by Quebec Airways in 1935. Canadian Airways bought out essentially Quebec Airways in the following year, and Canadian Pacific ended up with them during the war years. And she stalled on takeoff at Baie-Comeau and was damaged beyond repair. Now, the stalling accidents were reasonably common with these aircraft, and there seem to be several sources. One is when they're taking off, the lower plane is in ground effect while the upper plane is flying, and or not necessarily flying, sorry. So the pilot is, if they don't take care, they try and get out of the ground effect, and as the aircraft lifts and it stalls on the lower wing, and the upper wing is not able to help enough. So and also if they don't get the tail up, I was told by Mike Kimbrell, you can fly as fast as you want or go as fast as you want down the runway, and it'll never take off. And there's lots of Dragons ended up in the hedges at the end of the runway because they hadn't got the tail up. Now, Diana, if she's there, will recognize these pictures, as this aircraft her uncle flew. Consolidated Mining and Smelting used them. And when the Dragon Rapide became available, they converted to those because they had higher capacity and they were bigger aircraft. Howard Watt, North Shore Airways flew them. A lot of the flights were to take the forestry crews from the south shore of St. Lawrence to the north shore, where they were working, because during the spring and the fall, ice break up and freeze up. They couldn't use boats effectively, and this got the crews back and forth from places like Matan and Rimouski and those kind of situations. She was destroyed in Godbout while on skis. You'll read some things that say she was on floats, but of course the accident happened in the middle of winter, and she was on skis. It's just the high winds came up and the tie downs they had in the ice, I guess, didn't hold, and she got flipped over the dam and crushed in the river below. DDI is an American registered airplane. It's the same airplane that my grandparents flew on, and that's how I found out about her, through the Moth Club. She came to the UK, from the UK via Rotterdam by ship in 1971. And here she is flying in Washington State in 2013. She flew across the Rockies. That's why I put her on this list, because she got to Canada. She went to Wetaskiwin, with passengers on board for the Great de Havilland reunion in July 29th, 1984. And this picture, taken by my previous boss, Duncan Marshall, who's no longer with us, he went to that with his Tiger Moth, took this picture, and the white aircraft in the lower corner is DDI, the Dragon. And for scale, here's a steam otter right next to her. And of course, you can see the chipmunks and other de Havilland aircraft along here. Turns out that Mike Kimbrell, I had some pictures of one of his sons who was killed in a plane crash, but he attended this session with his sons and other friends. DDI continued. She is with her American registration, N34DH. And I'll show you the video shortly of our flight on it. It's a 5-minute video. And the Pathé newsreel, I'll see if I can pull that up in a minute at the end. It's quite interesting. It's only about 2 minutes long, in black and white with sound, but the sound quality wasn't very good. But we'll see how that goes. Oops. And there's Mike Kimbrell, the current owner, with his stable of aircraft. He has 13 aircraft and 13 kids. And his wife is a wonderful little lady who entertained us while we were there. She's about 5'2". And all the kids in the family fly and their grandchildren fly. So, but he's a wonderful guy. And here we have dragons in Canada at the end. Okay, so the DH.89 Rapide, there were quite a few of them in Canada. They didn't evolve from the Dragon, which is surprising. They had a different kind of start. I had a little fun with one of the graphics. The Havilland, the DH.89 was adapted from the DH.86, which was called the Express, and it was a 4-engine airliner, which was actually developed for the Australian market, but it wasn't very successful. They had a few problems with it, and it wasn't suited for the markets in Canada or in the UK at the time. 16 of 205 Rapides were built and shipped for assembly in Canada, but there were more assembled in Australia as well under license. But 16 sort of filled the gap. It's a bit difficult to see in this picture in the lower part, but the tail is again the swoop tail for floats. And there were several adaptations. One thing I asked, and Jerry's heard me ask this before, was the elliptical wing in the mid-30s was being used by de Havilland, but Shenstone got credit for designing the elliptical wing on the Spitfire later on, when the Supermarine apparently took the idea from some German designs. That's the story. And I don't know where the elliptical wing originated from. If that's the case, there seemed to be more than one source of engineering thinking going on here. The Rapide did not have foldable wings. They were constant spar all the way out. They had flaps introduced between the engines and the fuselage to help on landing. If you look at the skirts on some of these, the Canadian ones, you'll see the skirt under the undercarriage is different because it's to be adapted for skis and floats as well as wheels. Swooping tail I mentioned, you'll see that better in later pictures. They had a starboard exit door, which made it more convenient when they were docking in remote places so they could load from either side. Quebec Airways introduced a hatch for dropping the mail through the hatch, which they'd fly over communities and just drop a bundle of mail with a parachute on it at low altitude. And quick drain facilities so that the pilots could drain the oil and keep it warm at night. Or maybe they put it in their sleeping bags and kept them warm, I don't know. And then redesigned undercarriage spats I talked about, and then the nose light appeared. And You can see here the difference between the Dragon 2 and the Rapide. The performance increase in red is significant. They go 10 miles an hour further, or 10 miles further. Their normal cruise was 132, added roughly 15, 16 miles an hour. Maximum speed was increased. Their gross weight was increased. The dimensions you can see there. The wings didn't fold, of course, and the engines were boosted up to 200 horsepower Gypsy 6s. Now, I added this slide, Jerry, since you last saw it, because I thought the load limits distinguishing between the Rapides on wheels, you can see the spats, or the way the undercarriage is designed, or the streamlining is different in Canada. The tail is swooping. But the land plane could carry 1,255 pounds. The seaplane was significantly handicapped in terms of load capacity. The ski plane wasn't too bad. It's 200 and some pounds less. But you can see the picture of AYE in all three formats in this series here. And these skis aren't standard skis. They were the skis that were designed by National Research Council as an experiment to cut down on the number of wires and drag that was created, but they found it wasn't making enough difference to really matter. And this aircraft is in Quebec Airways colors. You can't get color pictures of these, so it has to be sketches to get an idea. But you can see the manufacturers. There's quite a few of them in Canada. And a lot of them, of course, bought aircraft from each other. Now, the Globe and Mail, that's a story you'll get in a minute. But they had a very short use of the aircraft as a press aircraft going up to basically check on the mining industry in Northern Ontario. And they tried to get the scoop on the mining industry. Consolidated mining and smelters out west and across the country. Matin Air Service, Chindercoot, Canadian Northern Air Services, and several private owners and the Vancouver Fire Department. Not used for water bombing, you'll see in a minute. 16 flew throughout Canada. The first registered in Canada was AEO. They were flight tested in Toronto as land planes and then flown to Longueuil to have Fairchild floats installed and camera holes installed and modifications. And here's Quebec Airways and on floats. Quebec Airways sold AEO to Canadian Airways. Beautiful looking aircraft though. And then there was a Moncton crash with an inexperienced pilot, probably a stall and takeoff. He'd done 2 or 3 circuits or 2 or 3 landing and takeoffs and was inexperienced. The weaknesses of the Dragon, and this is seen in the Dragon Rapide, this is seen in the context of single engine bush planes before, and the idea that it was more safety with the 2 engines. So, but they did have fuel tanks, which are right behind the engine, and they were surrounded by wood framing. So they burned quite well if there was a spillage of fuel, which is what happened to the Globe and Mail. They stalled because of the reasons I told you earlier. Biplane configuration was challenging when docking. You can see the bush, and of course here the left-hand or the right-hand door for access, which was not on the British aircraft. Radio grounding was an issue. Eventually they overcame it, but grounding on a wooden frame was very difficult, and the engine was about the only significant metal that you could get a ground on. And sometimes they flew with a trailing radio, which had its own problems about snags and drag and that sort of thing. And as you can see, BNE, they didn't float well on the ice. So quite often they landed on what they thought was thick enough ice, and there were examples where the company people had checked the ice and they hadn't noticed the thin spots. Now, the Joseph Factu tragedy was 1942, or the court case that followed it was 1942. The actual tragedy happened just before the war. A brand new aircraft, BND, was chartered by families involved in forestry in Montreal, and to check the timber rights. The aircraft was taken up by, it was supposed to be flown by Mike DeBleeky or Norman Forrester, who were contracted pilots, but the managers of Quebec Airways decided to put an inexperienced Joseph Factu on, who'd only flown along the coast of the St. Lawrence and never up into the northern country north of into Labrador. So he got lost, and he was running out of fuel. He landed the aircraft on a lake next to a dock. The lake became known as Dragon Lake. And there was a massive search with single-engine aircraft flying into uncharted territory in northern Quebec and Labrador. You have to remember that when they got lost, they were well off the track they were expected to be on. And radio communications was poor for several reasons. One was a language barrier. The pilot didn't know how to use Morse code, and his French, he was unilingual French, and the communities they were trying to contact were in English, and it was just a mess. And also, Labrador was part of Newfoundland, which wasn't part of Canada, so it was an international cooperation was needed. And they found BND tied to the dock at a trapper's cabin in 1940. The other issue with radios, of course, is the military didn't want too much radio traffic going on because of the St. Lawrence submarines, that sort of thing. And where they found the aircraft, they were just 15 miles from help in Island Harbor. The picture at the top is the cabin. The picture below is when they actually flew BND out. They took her off the floats where she was tied to the dock and put her on skis and flew her out after they'd removed the bodies from the cabin. The people died of starvation. The pilot was the first to die, and Davidson was the last, and his diary was found in the aircraft. It became a media circus because this was a well-known family, and CFBBC flew the bodies out to Rimouski. And what they had to do was the press knew where they were going. They were going to the transport or Department of Transport hangar in Rimouski. They put snow from the river landing strip to the hangar and into the hangar, so they could taxi the aircraft on skis right into the hangar and then close the doors and get some privacy. And the court case went through all the issues. Each heading I have here is almost a chapter in the court case on its own, but it did lead to new, more careful ways of doing bush flying, more radio help, that kind of thing. So, and as a result of the court case, the manager of Quebec Airways was found guilty of basically abusing the system, and the company was bought out by Canadian Airways. BND, by the way, I'll just go back a little bit. Both BBC and BND were flown by Gary Williams' father, and I missed the session. Gary was talking about it apparently in Regina the other day, but it's sort of ironic that one of our CAHS members had relatives involved in this whole tragedy after the fact when they were flying the airplanes. BND ended up on the West Coast with Queen Charlotte Airways. And it had flown in the meantime. It companies across the prairies and worked her way out to the West Coast. Ferryman was flying out of Prince Rupert area, and he filled up the fuel tanks one night and was ready to fly in the morning. And the next morning, he assumed he had full tanks, took off, and the engine started to splutter just after takeoff. And he hadn't noticed that somebody drained the fuel tanks, probably for motorboat fuel. And he ended up landing in Digby Island with no casualty. But imagine bringing a float plane into the woods. It must have been quite a challenge to survive something like that. And the remains of BND were acquired by the Royal Aviation of Western Canada in Winnipeg, but we're not sure yet whether the aircraft is stored in Winnipeg, what's left of it, or in Edmonton. Now, BBC, if you remember, it was the aircraft that flew the bodies out after Factus accidents. And she joined Canadian Pacific Airways in Winnipeg, and then CPA in 1938, and back the aircraft went back and forth between the companies. BBC was involved in the BND for flying out the bodies, as I mentioned. But in 1946, just after the war, she took off, ran out of fuel, and landed on the ice in the middle of the St. Lawrence during breakup. The full story is in the journal from the spring of 1981, or CAHS. It's about 10 pages long, so I couldn't go into all the details, but I'll summarize it here. Babe Willett wrote the article. And here she is, sitting in the ice. Everybody got out of the airplane safely. One of the fellows slipped off the ice and was never seen again. But the remaining 6 were on the ice floe. These were all guys who were foresters. They were pretty tough types, and they managed to survive. But they got separated on ice floes, and some of them got picked up by aircraft. There was a Grumman Goose, tried to get close to them, got some of them on one ice floe, but taking off in amongst the ice with an amphibious aircraft is tricky. So they didn't get everybody, and they saw where they were going. In Babe's story, he describes how the remaining 2 drifted 136 miles on the ice floe. You can see it on the map here. It's quite a distance. And if they had gone much further, they were into the Gulf of St. Lawrence big time. They got picked up by local fishermen and boats, but the whole RC rescue effect kept track of them. There was an American B-17 that tried to drop a boat, a rescue boat. Grumman, I mentioned, DC-3 looking around, and local boaters. So it took several days, and it was, again, covered by the press quite well. But it's a good article if you can get hold of it to read the whole story. Now, the Globe and Mail, I'm not going to go through every aircraft, but these are some of the more interesting stories. BB. This was George McCullough, who was who was the editor of the Globe and Mail, decided to have a flying newsroom. Be a good idea, sort of sexy of the time. First aircraft for the Globe and Mail, equipped with advanced radios. And it was a good-looking aircraft, but they only had it for 2 months. And she was refueling in Toronto Harbor, and spark ignited the fuel, and before you knew it, she looked like that. And by the time you get rid of all the wood and the fabric, there's not much left, except the engines and some flying wires, and of course the floats. And after the war, she was replaced by a Grumman Goose, which was fully equipped with radios. Now there's two Rapides, AYE. One is CF-AYE and the other was C-FAYE, different aircraft. The first one was a sales demonstrator brought to Canada, and they were hoping to fly it into the States and get some contracts. You can see the sweep tail here very clearly. They were fitted with experimental self-aligning skis, as the experiment in that earlier picture showed. And here's the same picture. And in May 1937, B&A, or British Northern Airways, I think it was, and Queen Charlotte Airways to CPA, and became the city of Zebulos, which is actually on the Vancouver Island west coast. Very small place. Central Northern Airways in Winnipeg had it for a while. Queen Charlotte Airways, in 1951, the fire department got it and used it for fire practice, which is a real shame. It was a nice airplane. Had a lot of history there too. Lady Faye was built in the UK, and she was eventually transferred over to, in 1950, as the Ville de Cannes, flew recreational parachutists in France. And here you notice that she has the conventional tail. After several private owners, she had a hangar collapse in Cork, Ireland. She'd been restored several times, overhauled and bought by George LeMay in Calgary. And he installed the curved tail after flying across the Atlantic. And he flew 6,000 miles. About 10% of his flying was done in Canada, but he came via Prestwick, Iceland, Greenland. He didn't try and do the Trail of the Caribou route, which was straight across, so he did the safe route. And he put 114 hours in Canada. And she's now in the Bush Plane Museum in Sault Ste. Marie. You can see inside her, and beautiful aircraft. So there's only two available in Canada to look at. And the PTK, there she is. I haven't discussed all the flying these aircraft did in England, but this gives you a rough idea over 1938 to 59, who was flying them. In 1961, the Canadian Northern Air Service Limited bought them for L'Orange, but they didn't work out economically on floats. And then eventually Kathleen, Jack, Michael, Rick, Beaudry kept transferring the plane within the family. And then it was dismantled and brought to Wetaskiwin, where they've been restoring it. And this is what she looks like today. She's on display, but she is in taxiable condition. They said they weren't going to plan to fly it, but they've restored it beautifully. So that's in Alberta. And so they were known to have they had some fire issues while flying for CP. BFT had an engine fire and did a forced landing, and that's the results. And there's quite a few pictures of bent ones like that, but this is a beautiful picture of BFP on the out in BC. And they were prone to stalling on takeoff, as I mentioned, raising the tail. And then this is how they ended up. And a nice aerial shot of BBH. Now, there was a mishap in Abbotsford in 2018. with a visiting de Havilland Dragon from the States, and being Abbotsford, it was just short distance across the borderline. But the aircraft was built in 1944 and really didn't see a lot of service. They were part of the RAF, communications type of aircraft at the time. She was shipped to the States in 1971. In the early 1970s, there wasn't much interest in these kind of aircraft in England. So a lot of them came over to the States, or some of them came over to the States, basically at bargain basement prices. It was donated to the EAA Museum in Oshkosh in 1974, rebuilt in California, became victim to a takeoff stall at Abbotsford. And again, this was the same scenario where it was the pilot got about 20 feet up in the air, flying on the ground effect. And then as soon as he got above that, then it stalled. And of course, he lost his legs. Jerry will have more information on that than I know. But I gather he lost a leg and is recovered and is flying again. So that's good news. And they were seen as a good sort of transitional aircraft. And if you think about it, because of de Havilland's experience with earlier aircraft and the Rapide and the Dragon, some of the thinking went into the design of the Beavers and the Otters, as well as their consulting with the bush pilots themselves. Only 2 Rapides can be seen in Canada, one at Wetaskiwin and one at Sault Ste. Marie. But there's flying all over the world. They're very popular at air shows.